I also don't think he loves how he sounds when he talks. I think that's
Nobody
a bit of a barrier.
I mean, if you do, you're insane. And the only people who don't mind it are the people who just have done it, like listen to it a lot.
Yeah, no, I definitely want to ask him, but it'd be exciting if he was on Slee Ricketts. That'd be really cool.
Yeah, no, no,
Anyway,
I definitely want to try to get him on. I will say it is interesting to me that I've started to, the response I've started to get from people when I've invited them is like, that sounds fun. I need to be careful. Yeah,
really?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh my
Uh,
God, that's so exciting. That means you're starting to like get, yeah, people are starting to hear about it. I think, Matthew, that what's going to happen is there's going to be like you're going to L shape it, and there's going to be one point at which like everyone starts listening.
I think this is that point. I think this interview is the breakthrough. This is what,
Oh,
this is
totally.
hot
Yeah,
takes on Ern
the
Malley.
one where I paddled about.
This is it. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. So I don't want to get too meta-textual today, but we do end up talking a little bit about the podcasting-ness of podcasting. So I will dig in a little bit, partly just because I've heard from some people in different directions, and sort of all different directions, about interview episodes, solo episodes, etc. And I was hoping I might clear up some of what I'm after. Not that I have quite accomplished anything like what I'm after. I'm still working on it. So I do plan, for a variety of reasons, to keep doing some solo episodes as well as episodes with guests. So the listeners, by the way, tend to be split between those who I'll say the small minority who only want to hear from me, and the varied majority who would sort of wish that some of my guests just hosted the podcast entirely instead of me. I want to give you an idea of kind of what I had in mind when I set out to do this, because there were, going into this, starting out on this ridiculous enterprise, to my understanding, there were three basic kinds of poetry podcasts. There were podcasts where you simply read a poem. So, you read a poem, particularly a poem you like, or you've selected for some reason for that day, and maybe you say a word or two about it, and then that's it. That's the end. Those tend to be very short. The Writer's Almanac is a pretty good example of that form. I always like the Writer's Almanac. It's to the point, and he does have a nice voice, much as my wife despises. Poor old Garrison Keillor. So that's one kind, right? Just poem reading podcasts, and those are fine. Those are probably the best kind, honestly. Particularly if you're reading poems you honestly enjoy. So then the second kind of poetry podcast, and this is, I think, far less common and maybe a little more slam or spoken word-ish, as well as being more British in my limited listening experience. This is the kind of podcast that is basically a single long-form performance piece by a kind of an auteur poet performer. So again, there aren't a whole lot of those, but there are some. And though I haven't fallen in love with any, I do respect that that's truly to echo Angela's point from way back. That is podcasting as art, good, bad, or indifferent art. That is an attempt to make art in its own right. So that's fine. So that's another kind of poetry podcast. The third and most common kind, well, not the most common, but maybe the most prominent kind, is the warm and fuzzy interview podcast. So the New Yorker poetry podcast is a great example of this. Poetry Foundation seems to have about 50 different versions of this, where a poet comes on, another poet shakes that poet's hand, rubs that poet's shoulders. They engage in kind of some light, incredibly harmless banter, and then mostly they just talk about how the poems are wonderful and they're wonderful and everything's wonderful for 45 fucking minutes. There is, of course, another kind, which is really what I was sort of aiming for, which is something closer to the Poetry Gods, which was poetry, reading and performing, but also a lot of gossip and shit talk and just riffing, as well as the more serious and very, very short-lived All Up in Your Ears, which was hosted by Vivi Francis, Gabrielle Calvacaresi, and friends of the podcast, Jonathan Farmer, sincerely, and Kava Akbar, ironically. Sorry, that was unclear. They all hosted the podcast sincerely, but Kava Akbar is a friend of this podcast, only ironically. So that was that at least had that podcast was a sort of an attempt to get under the hood and dig around in poems and sort of pull apart what's actually happening, what might be better or worse. But as I said, it was very, very short-lived. There's also Poetry Says, though I did not know about that, and we will get into more of that soon enough. But coming into the field, I thought, well, shit, I would love to have a little bit more honest talk, shop talk, gossip, shit talk, the kind of cozy, catty, technically rich conversation that I actually have with poets. This is what Alice always calls the off-mic conversation on mic. So that was really the goal with this podcast. And with that in mind, I realized that, there are, as I said, there are plenty of very boring, warm and fuzzy poetry interview podcasts. And there are also plenty of, more or less warm and fuzzy literary fiction interview podcasts. But most of the podcasts I listen to tend to be about politics or pop culture. And there's a structural difference between those and these literary podcasts for the most part. And the structural difference is that while the literary podcasts, especially the poetry podcasts, have sort of reverently handled guests to be interviewed, the politics and pop culture podcasts, when they have visitors, those visitors are really treated as teammates, as members of a team joining in to help talk shit about this thing that they all are obsessed with, that they all love and have enough respect for to talk shit about. And that is really what I am hoping for. I am going to continue to have guests. Some of these will be more of a proper interview. I actually just sort of lined up a few pretty exciting guests. I'm really kind of psyched about. So that is going to be coming up. I'm finally reaching beyond my my immediate and semi-immediate circle of acquaintances, some of whom are genuinely brilliant, as you already know, and some of whom are just ordinary run-of-the-mill jerks like Brian Platzer. But I'm gonna be doing some interviews, as well as I'm hoping some inviting on of teammates to help me gang up on poetry, which I would love for us to have enough respect for, not to handle with such fucking kid gloves all the time. So, with that in mind, I have back on the podcast today Allan of the aforementioned Poetry Says podcast. We have a couple articles about John Ashbery. She brings up Ern Malley, but really it's sort of a rambling, silly, gossipy, slightly bickering, nitpicky, off-mic poetry conversation on mic. Let's get to that right now. I enjoyed your kind of interestingly structured most recent episode. It reminded me that it made me want to play with formatting a little more. You had this episode of Poetry Says where it was like no bookends, no intro, just just like voicemails left back and forth between you and it sounds like your partner's coworker who's recently got into poetry. Is that right?
Yeah, no, he's not. He's not my partner's colleague. He's just a friend of mine. But
Okay.
yeah, I we kind of got halfway through the conversation, and I didn't include these messages, but at one point I was like, "Could I use this?" And then I asked him like five more times 'cause I just wanted to make sure that it was okay. But yeah, I'm really happy with it. It's
Yeah,
fun to do
it's
something
like
different.
it was like Rilke, but like letters to a middle-aged poet. It had a little bit of that like ambiguity about the what exactly it was after, but also like earnest attempt to dig into this question of like what poetry is, what it's good for, and what it's worth, like what's worth trying out with it.
Yeah, and he's coming from this position of just total openness. Like he's got no assumptions. He's just like, what is this thing? And of course, I completely fail to explain it in any kind of effective way. And at the end, the conversation just sort of dwindles away. Although that said, after we recorded that, he did go off and write like a really good Petrarchan sonnet, which was really annoying. Really annoying.
After his total dismissal of rhyme and form is superficial and outdated, unnecessary.
Completely.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, it's
nice to see that
annoying.
he can do it effortlessly. Yeah, no, I mean, I thought you did about as well as one could do, which is sort of to say like, well, here's a thing I like, and here's some specific poems that I think are worthwhile,
Yeah.
and like, that's about all you can. Like, part of me listening to him developed sort of theories on the fly as he was going, but wanted to say like, hey, calm down, take it easy, like relax. But then I also think like, well, part of when you're starting out is you're just sort of scrambling to find your bearings and like say, it's this. No, wait, it's this. No, like that's fine. That's part of what happens.
Yeah, but it is just weird trying to introduce someone to poetry because it's really different to, like we said last time, movies or music or whatever. You don't feel this weird sense of responsibility to defend the form as a thing. And whenever I talk about poetry with someone who's just getting into it, I feel this sense of like, if I don't get this right, they're going to just wander off and never come back. They're never going
Yeah.
to come back to my weird shop with all my strange esoteric stuff that I'm selling because there's a mall down the road
Yeah.
where they can get
Yeah.
everything they need.
Though at least in his case, it felt a little bit like with cults often, like he sort of wanted to join a cult to start. Like he's really like, you're not preaching on the street corner. It's like somebody comes to you and says like, yeah, so I'm curious about poetry. It's like, well, there's already something wrong with you if you're asking that question. So we're like, we can welcome you. Come, like, yeah,
Welcome.
you've self-selected for this terrible life. So I wanted to quickly, if I could, get you in trouble, just because I'm curious.
Mm.
We're in the Apple podcast algorithm. When you look at a particular podcast, it recommends shows to you.
Oh, yeah.
Like if you like this, you might like these other things. And what I found curious was that very few there. If you like Slave Rigs, by the way, very few other podcasts you will like. Apparently, it's a very short list. But if you look at yours and you look at mine, there are two shows in common that it recommends. If you
Oh,
like,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, well, sorry, no, it says that you might like the other. Like if you like Portuguese, you might like this one, and then vice versa. But then apart from those, the other two recommendations are Red Scare, which I don't know if you know it.
I have heard of Red Scare. I haven't listened
Yeah,
to it. Yeah.
like neo Soviet contrarian dirtbag girl talk. I mean, it's kind of like it's hard to define, but and then the other one is The Garret, which is an Australian show.
Ah, the
And it made me
Garrett. Yeah.
want to ask, like, well, what's the Garret, Alice? I've never, what's the deal? What is it?
Oh,
This is why I'm asking.
Matthew.
This is why I'm trying to get you in trouble because like as soon as I saw it, I was like, Alice is going to have a hard time speaking in public. I can, you can, but you don't have to. But I'm curious.
I
It's
don't
a big
know.
deal
Look,
in Australia, apparently. Yeah.
yeah, I think I've only listened to a couple of episodes. I think the majority of the episodes are interviews with fiction writers.
Hmm.
There's a few interviews with poets, which is probably why I ended up there. But I think, having only listened to a couple of episodes, it's one of those more like, oh, you just had a book out, come talk
Hmm.
to me on my podcast kind of thing. So, yeah, but I think it's been going for ages and I should probably know more about it. But I only listen to a few.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
That seems prudent in its brevity as a, as a kind of one. All right. I'll buy it. I'll say
I'm
yeah.
really picky with my podcasts that I listen
Yeah.
to. Like I'm not a particularly generous listener. If I get bored, I'm gone. So yeah.
That's the there's actually an Orwell essay I'm hoping to talk with somebody about soon that he talks about like part of the beauty of radio. This is like obviously way before podcasts is that you don't you know your listener is not captive. That like
Exactly.
you have free reign to talk as much as you want, no one can interrupt, but also your listener can switch away at any moment.
Yeah, this is why I don't get like a couple of times people have said, I like your podcast, Alice, but it's a bit long. I'm like, but just turn it off and go do something else. Like it's fine. It's
I
just weird.
yeah, or like you can also like pause it, like
Yeah.
or like skip or yeah, yeah. I suspect that there. I think there is a generational gap, like in terms of how people take in podcasts. Like there. It does seem like my impression has been that older listeners want shorter bites. And I'm wondering if they're like, I mean, I hope this is not the case, but I wonder if there are people who genuinely sit down in an armchair and stare at the wall and listen until it's over, which seems like insane. At least like I don't know about you, but like I don't drive a lot, but I have a lot of chores to do, and that's
Yeah.
generally when I listen to things, like when I'm doing laundry or dishes or something.
Yeah, that's what they're for. Yeah.
Right. And like those, there's no end day. Like those go on forever. Those expand to fill all the time in the world. So
Exactly.
yeah. No. All right. Well, yeah, we have a kind of an odd plan or program for today.
Yeah.
We looked at a couple different articles and we're going to talk about two that are what they have in common is John Ashbery. And what we have in common is that we have read very little John Ashbery.
We
What
are the best possible people to have this discussion.
yeah, we are fully
Yeah.
equipped.
Yeah.
Nobody could do it better. So, just to start, what is coming in cold? What is your working sense of John Ashbery?
My working sense of John Ashbery. I don't know if I would say I'm coming in completely cold because the few Ashbery poems that I know I have spent a lot of time with, and one of those being Some Trees, um, which, I've studied over and over again and like had memorized for a little while. So that's kind of like a bit of a Rosetta Stone poem for me. But my sense of him as I watched a bunch of interviews and did a bit more reading is that he's a hedonist and he
Hmm.
just wants to have fun. He would like you to have fun, but that's kind of a bonus. He's not really worried about reception or understanding. He is just doing his work in the way that makes sense to him, and he's somehow able to occupy this position of just kind of a big old shrug in terms of what you think of it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That seems totally accurate. You do then. You have there at least there are a couple poems that are well, but also that sounds like you like or you find valuable, you find worthwhile
Yeah,
returning
I
to.
love I love Some Trees, and I really like another poem of a really early poem of his called The Instruction Manual, which is a really straightforward poem about having a boring office job and wishing that you were somewhere else. As I got
Some
ready,
trees was that the title poem of his first book?
yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I mean, and that's the other thing is I sort of tried to scramble to like refresh my Ashbery memory. It's fucking enormous. Like he has so many poems. I mean, you can't. I don't think there is a collected. I mean, they're like collected for certain stretches of decades, but like even the most recent one, I think ends in like the late 80s. I mean, it's insane. It's just so
mm.
much for so long. He was incredibly prolific. It,
Yeah, and that kind of to me just makes it feel impossible to have any kind of useful take because it's like, well, I could talk about one or two poems, but I'll never be able to read all 26 books. I would never want to. I would never want to. In
no.
fact, I think one thing that I read somewhere was like, it was a review of one of his books, and the reviewer was saying the number of people who would have read this collection of long poems is probably quite small.
Yeah.
Like, five people, or maybe just the editor, or maybe just Ashbury himself. But he doesn't seem
Yeah.
to care about that.
No, well, no, that, I mean, that certainly seems true. That was like there's Kenneth Goldsmith said something similar about his like insane books that are just like transcripts of newspapers or things where he said like they're not intended to be read. They're intended to be known about and to exist. And and with Ashbury, it seems like I think you're exactly right that maybe the additional ingredient is like, and he had fun.
Yeah, he had fun.
Yeah, and that
Mm.
yeah that does seem in a way like I he's never been my favorite poet, and I found his poetry frustrating and irritating often when I've gone to it, but I do have respect for that what drives him is pleasure, even if it's not my pleasure. That's at least that's an honest motivation. That's something that actually has to do with poetry itself.
Yeah.
So these two essays, one's very, I guess we can start with the Shane McCrae one because it's quite short. So Shane McCrae wrote this. This seems to be, and I don't know, it seems to be basically like a promotional essay for the Library of America. Like I don't know if it was used as an intro in a book or something, but they got him to write this short thing, and he mentions their some of their collections, but basically he's writing about a personal experience. The essay is called "My War with John Ashbery." It was on the Library of America website. The story he tells is of encountering Ashbery as a 20-year-old high school dropout and being sort of bewildered, but also intrigued, and then spending several years desperately trying to imitate him and then trying to avoid imitating him and kind of finding him to be this black hole. I'll just read like a nugget of it. He says, I ineptly borrowed from him until I started writing the poems that would become my first book 9 years after my mind was first expanded by his and. He starts the title of a book with and that was inspiring to a young Shane. Now I find myself returning again and again to Library of America's 2-volume collected, by far the most comprehensive Ashbery collection in print, as well as to Ashbery's later books. And yet I admit I'm still afraid when I sit down to read him. I struggled to not sound like Ashbery for years. I still feel as if he might overwhelm me. And in the end, I only managed the trick of not sounding like him by trying a new trick. The trick, it turns out, wasn't to not sound like Ashbery. If that had been what I kept trying to do, I never would have pulled the trick off. The trick was to sound like myself. So what did you make of this one just to start? Because this was mentioned in a much longer piece that we also read, but I figured we start here.
Yeah. Well, I wanted this piece to be about 3 times as long. I feel like Shane McCrae was working to a really harsh word limit here.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's a lot more to the story that we haven't quite got to. But
Yes.
I don't know if you would agree with this, but I feel like almost nobody does this. Nobody comes out and says, this is what catalyzed my writing, this one, in this case, one word, one poet. And I spent years trying to sound exactly like this specific person. Because like if you ask poets about like, oh, when did you start writing and who did you read and blah blah blah, they'll be vague and they'll be like hand wavy about it. But Shane's like, no. I wanted to sound like Ashbery, and I tried really hard to sound like Ashbery, and I couldn't do it. And then eventually, I decided to sound like myself, and I really relate to that. Like I spent a good, I don't know, maybe 5 or so years trying to sound like other people, probably longer. Um, but
Don't
I
be
don't know.
vague now, Alice. Who's yeah?
Okay, so
Shel
I had
Silverstein.
a sorry.
Sorry, I said Shel Silverstein. Though I don't know if you know him, and he's a children's book author. Yeah, I'm sorry, never mind. Yeah.
Totally. No, I had a poetry mentor, the poet Bonnie Cassidy, and I would write poems that I thought Bonnie would like, and as such, I wrote poems that I thought sounded like Bonnie. They didn't, and a lot of them she didn't like, and I grew as a poet because she said so. Um, and it's funny because Bonnie sounds a lot like Gig Ryan, who sounds a lot like Ashbery, and Bonnie also sounds a bit like Michael Farrell, who is known as Australia's foremost Ashberian, who also put out a little anthology last year called Ashbery Mode, which had a bunch of Australian poets writing sort of in response to Ashbery. He cast a really
That's also
long
like a
shadow.
surprisingly frank title for an anthology.
Yeah, no, it's pretty great, and So I guess in a weird roundabout way, I also have been trying to sound like John Ashbery through these other
Third
poets who
hand,
I
but
was trying to imitate. Yeah, third hand. So yeah, I don't know. Do you think like do you find that people are frank and upfront about that sort of stuff with you, or
uh, I don't know. I mean, I do think that and I don't know how accurate this is in Australia, but there's certainly a great there's a cult of originality or even of novelty in America. Certainly, like we really value pioneers and iconoclasts and new original voices and in fact like one of the truisms about grad school, which I've always found to be like semi nonsensical, is that that's when you find your voice as a poet, and that's really like the most important thing is to distinguish yourself, which I mean is almost like directly a a capitalist maxim, like identify your brand, corner your part of the market on something. But yeah, I mean I certainly have spent most of my writing life trying to and imitating a lot of, like, when I was quite young, a lot of Cummings and Billy like not cool poets, and then later getting obsessed with Larkin and Hausman, and even like a couple of living poets, Richard Wilbur, E. Stallings, and at times like trying to, as McRae says in here, like having to put certain books down and avoid looking at them because they're too
mm-hmm.
infectious. Yeah, maybe that's really it. Like there's no, unless you are specifically paying homage to someone, which would probably need to be somebody alive, there's nothing really to be gained by admitting that you've spent a lot of time imitating someone. And even if you are imitating someone alive, that person probably doesn't really want you to be doing that. So it's hard to, like, there's no way to do it so that it's successfully self-promotional. So there's something like naked and selfless about saying, like, so this was what happened with me. As I think you're right. I think you're both right that, like, I'm glad for Shane to be doing this, and I also would love to hear the next 3,000 words on this,
Yeah, for sure. Because while it might not benefit you, the poet,
Yeah.
it certainly benefits others who are starting out and lets them know that there isn't necessarily this thing that is the voice that's going to come through you and make everything okay. And all of a sudden you're going to be this original genius. Like, you're going to start by imitating specific people, and that's okay. You don't have to be ashamed of that. That's how you learn.
Yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't get said very much.
Yeah. And that's part of what I found, like, maybe the most important thing I figured out about poetry in college was not anything to do with my own voice or my own anything, but except that I started out imitating anybody who was supposed to be good. And by the time I finished college, I was only imitating people I genuinely liked. So there's still nothing original, but like it took a while, and it took like partly having people point out, like, no, I don't think that that's actually good. So you don't need to try to imitate it. Like say, oh, I can
Yeah.
just try to do things that I think I would like if I were to read them.
Yeah, completely. And like you talked about this before in terms of your uh, friendship with Ryan, just about giving each other that permission to say like, no, this person sucks. Just walk away.
Yeah,
It's fine. Yeah.
right. It was just really, and as well as like, this person is not cool, but it's pretty, and you like it, and so it's okay. Like it. I mean, that's maybe that's part of it. It's like I learned to disregard prestigious chores and embrace guilty pleasures.
Oh my God, Ashbury is the most prestigious chore though. Like that is such a perfect way to put it. I sat down and read a bunch of poems to prepare for this, and there were a few that I really liked.
Yeah.
I don't want to read them again. I don't want to go back to them.
Yeah. Are there lines that, like, what's the Houseman says you should, the no way you've read a good poem is you remember a line the next day and you cut yourself shaving. Is that likely to happen with I don't know how often you shave, but like is that likely to happen with an Ashbury line for you?
Mm, I wrote a couple down, but they
Yeah.
just dissolve in your brain, right? Like I wrote a few down. There was one poem that had the line, "Oh, leaving the Atocha station, no forest you can name." That's very pretty.
Right, right.
But
Because
the
in the
poem,
other, yeah, because Lerner is named as like as a an Ashbery acolyte, and that's of course the name of his first novel.
yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah.
But that poem also includes the line, "The clean fart genital enthusiastic toe prick album serious evening flames," which is just ridiculous.
I mean,
It's
yeah,
just
that's borderline
irritating.
flarf. I mean, it does. So, all right. So, I was trying to figure out what it is about Ashbery that. So, I mean, he has a. When I was in college, like the the virtue most prized in the workshops I was in was being unpredictable. That was what people
Hmm.
most cared about, was like that you would, you know, people would never guess what came after X word or X line break or X stanza break. And that was sort of the best thing you could do. And he certainly has that down pretty well. Like he is just pretty hard to see where an Ashbery poem is going. But I think there's I was trying to think, like there are, and obviously part of what he does is also just play with language in ways that are new. I mean, that's the thing that first attracted Shane to the his poetry, is like, oh, I didn't know you could do that. And
Yeah.
obviously, like, that is part of, especially early on, you know, when you're falling in love with poetry, is just discovering, oh, that's a thing you can do. But I think that there's, in addition to being unpredictable and being, you know, being innovative, he is very crisp, not maybe in that particular line you quoted, but he tends to be very clean and crisp in his constructions.
Mm.
And he combines like an absolute authority with a total lack of context.
Yeah.
Like it's something I remember hearing David Lynch say, that like part of what he did with when he told stories with his movies was he would tell the story and then he would just remove all context, which to me seems like a maniacal or sadistic choice. But it does seem to be part of what happens with Ashbery. It's like, it's not that the person talking is babbling. Like the person talking is talking this way on purpose, is speaking thoughtfully and deliberately and with some kind of intention. It's just that we have no way of getting our bearings.
Which is a little bit sadistic, right? Like I go back and forth on this with Lynch all the time. Like I'm a huge David Lynch fan, but half the
Yeah.
time I'm like, does this guy hate me? Is he is he trying to ruin my life?
Yeah.
And yeah, and Ashbury again, just that sense of like I don't really care what you get from this. I'm just gonna write it down.
I think that I don't know Lynch nearly as well as I might, but based on the couple few movies I've seen, my impression is that, as with Ashbery and the Greek gods, it's not hatred, it's indifference.
Yep, 100%.
Because I was also thinking, like a poet I did really fall in love with in college, Mark Strand, clearly has some common DNA with Ashbery, but I think maybe what Strand is a little bit less. There's a little bit less of a sense of a what's the Douglas Adams bit, the infinite improbability engine. There's a little bit less of that total randomness generator that there is in Ashbery, and there's just more of a consist. Like part of what Strand does is I think he produces a consistent, compelling mood or atmosphere. So even when it's so sort of nonsensical, the combination of the authority and the atmosphere feel cool and like something, you know, like I've said, I didn't spend much time imitating Ashbery. I definitely spent a lot of time poorly imitating Strand,
Hmm.
until I
Hmm.
finally thankfully gave up. Here's the thing that most I felt like is almost like a trick Shane plays on us at the end of this essay. The line that to me felt like, God damn it, that's the whole essay. You just skipped it. Is the trick was to sound like myself.
Yeah.
Like, well, that's the result of the trick. But how, like, that seems like you didn't tell us anything about what you were trying to do. Like, how do you fucking
Yeah.
get there? How do you?
Yeah, how do you get there, Shane? Come on. Yeah, sidebar. Also, just to say to listeners, like there's an episode where you read one of Shane's poems.
Mhm.
Is it titled "Sometimes I Never Suffered"? Is it the
The
title poem of the
line, it's the
collection?
title of the book is Sometimes I Never Suffered, and that's the line in the poem. But the poem itself is
Right,
called, I think it's Jim Limber Speaks of Continuity in Heaven. I think that's it.
right, right. It is just so beautiful. It is
Oh
so, so
yeah,
beautiful. And yeah, it would be great to know how Shane went from Ashbury to there. So come on the podcast and tell us.
I would really. He in his poetry and his prose, there's definitely a sense of like a feverishly talented mind that sometimes fails to slow down enough for the the reader to catch hold. Yeah, I would definitely love to. I would definitely love to get Shane to talk about
Yeah,
any
hopefully
number
that
of these
happens.
things.
But
Um,
yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
there's a sense talking about Ashbury though, like talking about a poet who just so clearly doesn't care. I mean, there's a late interview of his that I watched as well where he's being asked, "Oh, what about this line? What about that line?" This is from like a recent collection, and he's like, "Ah, oh, I don't really remember that. Is Kafka in it? I don't remember if Kafka's in it. I don't really remember my poems very well." And it's like, well, if you don't care about these 26 collections and they're hard for me to read and they dissolve in my brain, I'm not very motivated. I've just, yeah, that makes me feel like I'm being a little bit tricked
Yeah.
to spend time.
So then my question is, by whom? Because I feel as if it may not be
By
by
Ben
Ashby,
Lerner.
like right. I mean, right by Ben Lerner, but I mean by people who by it's not by Ashbury, it's by Ashbury's importance, about which I think Ashbury also doesn't particularly give a shit. Like
No.
he came of age at a certain time and he was gifted in a certain way and he had success early enough on that he's just been kind of coasting and like coasting brilliantly at times. Like, and I do, like Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror is probably the one poem of his I've really read and come back to and found impressive. Not because I haven't found other poems impressive, just because I haven't read that fucking much. But
Mm.
he's yeah, I feel like he was on vacation most of his life, and it was like a fairly productive vacation, and people pestered him for poems, and so I mean, I feel like Ashbery's like maybe the last 2/3 of his career were him having dinner and people kept asking him for autographs. Like, and he was like, fine, here's a
How
napkin.
exhausting.
And so like then, but then like, then the napkins became the subject of like major symposia that you then were told were like very influential and important. And that's why you need to learn them.
Completely. And this second piece, the David Sherman Wallace
Yeah.
piece, Dead Poet Anxiety, starts to get into this question of did he live a bit too long?
Mm.
And did people start to lose a sense of his importance as it got towards the end? Did we all start to decide, oh, maybe the Emperor really is naked here? But I think he also would have been aware of that. Like I found out this morning, my very favorite ever Ashbury fact is that he taught this poet, Ern Malley. I don't know if you can see him.
Who didn't exist, right?
Yeah, hoax poet. And
Yeah.
he taught the Australian hoax poet Ern Malley for like 30 years, apparently, in his writing classes. And I
Wait,
just love that.
so Ern Malley was the invention of two Australian poets,
Yes.
but they in Ern Malley's biography, they list Ashbery as like a longtime teacher. Or
No,
so
Ashbury in real life. Sorry, yeah, it
okay,
gets
yeah.
confusing when you talk about Ern
Yeah.
Malley. In real life, Ashbury loved the work of Ern Malley and taught it in his writing classes.
Oh, I sorry. I thought I thought you were saying he taught the person Ern Malley. Yeah, he taught the poems by Ern. Yeah. Oh, that makes perfect sense. I totally
Yeah,
believe that. Yeah.
yeah. I really love that. So yeah, he was aware of this sort of tricksterism that was going on all the time, and yeah, and you get this sense in this late interview that he's still just shrugging and bemused that anyone's asking him about his work. So I don't think he would have minded that
Yeah, he
however
he
many
was
years
his own
on.
Ern Malley in some respects, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
Except maybe without that, because the Ern Malley hoax was like there was some degree of like hostility and like there was some frustration or resentment in that, whereas like Ashbury seems completely angst free.
Yeah, totally angst free.
Because if I remember, like the two poets who invented Ern Malley and like cranked out a bunch of poems that people then loved, their own work was never as successful as what they invented for Ern Malley.
No,
Yeah.
that's kind of one of the tragedies of it is that yeah, one of them moved to Japan and kind of wrote from there, and the other wrote for a little while and then stopped. And They're just neither of them really have any kind of poetic legacy except that they created one of the most influential Australian poets who has ever not lived. Like, we will never escape Ern Malley. Never.
He is probably, yeah, I was going to say he is probably the one semi-canonical Australian poet I knew of. Before, like,
That's amazing.
right. I mean, it's like Ern Malley and then John Forbes is probably the next most famous one I knew. So yeah, so there was this other essay. David Sherman Wallace had this piece in The Drift, which I had not heard of, and this was from just a couple months ago. It's called "Dead Poet Anxiety," subtitled "John Ashbery in the Age of Social Media." And there were sort of two. He goes back and forth, but it seemed like there were sort of two essays in the essay. One was about John Ashbery's legacy, and one was about the world of the mostly online world of poetry and poetry social life today.
Yeah, I think they could have been separated. I think there are two essays here, and he's kind of mashing them together in a way that's a little bit uncomfortable. But, maybe no one will read your piece about John Ashbery, but if you talk about social media, they will.
Yeah, and so what was your talk if you will about pick one and pick one of the essays and talk about it. We'll break it down.
Well, I think you make some good points about, Ashbery is hard to screenshot, and the way that poems are presented online tends to shape them. I think that's a pretty obvious point, but it's a useful point, I guess. I had a go at, in line with your jibber jabber revelation kind of formula.
Yeah.
I was like, for the epiphanic poem, I thought, well, what does an Instagram poem want? And I came up with the formula: bad things are bad. This is a poem. Poems are good things. You are okay. For me.
Yeah, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Yeah. It's like a nonsense syllogism. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just, I think one of the things that the writer is sort of saying here is like, where you go to poetry online for a totally different reason than you might go to poetry in a book. And I would agree with that. I think when I'm going to Instagram, I'm there because I'm feeling like a little bit shaky, want a bit of reassurance, want to feel a little bit like held and understood or entertained or something. And I want that, like, you are okay, everything's fine. Everything's fucked up, but everything's fine.
Do you want to know my wife's like stone cold chilling assessment of social media? Well, she loves social media as well, but her like, because she's a psychiatrist, like her psychiatric assessment is intermittent positive reinforcement.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, 80%
Like,
of the time you're not getting the you're okay, but occasionally you do get it.
every once in a while you turn over a rock and there's a leprechaun, and then you're instantly bored with that leprechaun, but you want to see if the next rock might have a leprechaun as well.
Maybe there's a leprechaun
And
in it. Yeah,
most
totally.
of them don't. Yeah, and he talks about a couple maybe things that make Ashbery, and not just Ashbery, but like also other poets of his and earlier generations, less digestible online, though not William Carlos Williams, whose Cold Plum poem will live forever online. But part of it is that Ashbery wrote some long poems, and part of it was that he was not very he seldom, if ever, advanced a clear, readily identifiable message in his poems, which does seem to be part of what people want in online poems. And then he talks a little bit about Ashbery and this question of identity, that like Ashbery was clearly like one of the most famous contemporary, openly gay poets, but he was, for being openly gay, he didn't really talk about it. It was not really something that came up much in his work. He didn't make a point of it. And Wallace says that like this seems maybe like a today maybe seems more like an expression of privilege than anything else, if not an expression just of the repressive quality of the time. Though I don't know, reading Ashbery, like I don't get the impression that there was a kind of poetry he was not getting to write that he really wanted to write. Like I think he was writing the poems he wanted to write.
No. Yeah, like, is it privilege or is it avoidance? Like, if Ashbery started writing today, would he position himself as a queer poet?
Yeah, oh,
Uh,
God only knows. And I mean, I also think like there's also, I mean, part of the question has also got to be like it certainly like he came of age at a time when people were much less open, and there was a much more. I mean, there are problems of all kinds that are less present today, but also his specific life was such that he kind of got to live the way he wanted. I mean, like he would, not to say that he didn't encounter shitheads or prejudice, but that I get the impression that like he sort of got to do what he wanted all around in most
hmm.
respects. And so it may have been like if that had been different, if he lived in a different part of the country, say, or if he had not been successful in his poetry in the same way early on, maybe that would have been a different thing. Like it wasn't made to be the center of things for him, and so he was able to sleep with whom he wanted and write the poems he wanted and kind of veg out as it seemed.
Yeah, one of the things I wrote in my notes here is kind of coming off the back of your last episode where you talked about this lack of urgency that you were seeing in anthologies that you were reading and stuff. And I just thought, is there a less urgent poet than Ashbery? Like, it just doesn't matter. None of
Yeah,
it matters.
no, that's probably quite true. It's not, though. I mean, and that's why I think of like people asking for his autographs. Like he he lived a long time and he started publishing early on, but he also published like every couple few years. And he like you would think there was a more urgency. I'm always a little bit surprised by like how it is hard to get a book of poems published, but but people who are able to get books of poems published seem to publish a fucking lot of them. Like they seem to publish them very, very often. And like as if there is this sort of urgency. And again, my feeling is always like, you'll never be sad that it came out a year later.
Mm.
He describes in this writing his poems as dipping a bucket in a swiftly flowing stream. That seems like both an affirmation and a condemnation
Yeah,
of his
yeah.
work.
Wallace is a little bit bitchy after that. He says, with 26 full length books of poetry, it's a marvel that any liquid remained below. Funny.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But is there any resentment in the US towards somebody who published so much and cast such a long shadow? Because I know that here, people who publish a lot are not popular with poets. We don't like them. We want people to stop putting books out.
I wish there were, the O'Connor line where she said, "Sometimes I am asked if the universities stifle young writers, and my response is that they do not stifle enough of them." And my feeling is a little bit like,
I never heard
uh,
that.
I wish people were more resentful of poets who publish a lot. Yeah, there is some resentment, but I will say that I would say that less often if I felt like it were said more often. There certainly ought to be that kind of resentment. Is there?
Mm.
So there is more of a. I mean, maybe it's just because it's a smaller ecosystem. There's more of a sense of is it like. I mean, because there's plenty of like sort of vague and like inconsistently applied language here about, especially like more a couple years ago with at the height of Me Too, like lean out and don't take up so much space and quiet down. So there's some of that, but that again it tends to be very vague in general. And like my complaint is, as with Twitter, like my complaint with Twitter was never it's too short. It's too fast. Like
Mm.
my brother invented a version of Twitter. I suggested like, well, what if there were a Twitter, but you could only publish like once a day? You only put, and his response was, well, what if there were a Twitter, but you could only publish once? Like, it was just a collection of everybody got one. And you feel, it's like, that's my feeling with poets is like, I don't write less and it's not even like, don't put out another book. It's just wait a little bit. Just like we were talking to a poet here who was like was like a pretty successful. I mean, certainly like from my perspective, like quite successful youngish poet who'd had a decent splash with his first book, and he said he had two collections he was sending out and trying to get published. And I said, well, have you thought about just taking the best poems from each of them and making one? And it was a totally alien thought to him, but like that's what I want to say to everybody. It's
Mm.
like just fewer with better.
Yeah, no, that's what Bonnie said to me early on. She was like, "Look, there's no rush. You don't have to make your mark until you're ready." And I was so resistant to that. I was like, no, everyone else has a book. I want a book. I want a book now.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad she slowed me down. In some ways, I wish I had waited another 2 to 5 years, but that's also fine.
And you have to getting the first one out. You have to kind of purge something.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I really liked what I think this was in the last episode as well. You're also saying like we could stand to tell younger poets like that's great what you're doing. Now keep going, keep working, keep reading, keep writing. Don't necessarily pay attention to any of the like sparkles and praise and gold stars that you're getting. Like,
Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
praise, I think, is almost work. Like, praise is good insofar as it keeps you going. But beyond, like, if
mm.
you are still writing, then you probably don't need more praise. Is my suspicion. Like, don't, no, like,
Yeah,
seriously, like, don't read the blurbs on your own book. Don't read reviews. Don't like, it's not going to, unless there's like a good criticism or you need something to like stay afloat. It's probably poisonous, right? Is my kind of, I mean, I don't know, maybe just be me, but it feels like it's because like one of the best ways to manipulate people is to praise what you want them to do, right?
mm.
And I don't need to say that like critics are trying to manipulate anyone, but like if somebody tells you, and you know what I love about you, Alice, that you're always on time. Then like you feel like, oh fuck, I really got to be on time now. Like, I will lose this person's love forever. So I think like no matter what somebody says about like this is who you are as a poet, this is what makes your work great. That's the last thing you want to hear,
Yeah.
right? That's terrible.
Yeah, which is where the whole thing of voice becomes an issue because if you so Shane says that he learned to write like himself and I
Mhm.
think that that's
Please come
obviously
on and tell us
good.
how, Shane.
Tell us
Please come
how.
on and tell us
Yeah.
how.
But also I don't know, could that be a trap if you're being praised for writing, you've got this distinctive voice that is so different to everybody else, like you're saying, this sort of um, cult of individuality, then are you allowed to mess with that? Are you allowed to try to do something different?
I heard a good lecture that Alice McDermott made, not not novelist, not a poet, though she started as a poet actually, where she said something to that effect that like there is a particular risk that comes with artistic success, which is that you can continue doing what you have already done well at risk of self-parody, or you can depart from it at risk of failure and humiliation and confusion.
I think this conversation is just making me want to stop writing altogether.
Well, but writing short poems, I think it's part of what's wonderful about that is like that's so scary if you think about something like a novel, right? Like I'm going to set
Yeah.
out to do a completely different kind of novel than like if I was just successful with a novel and now I want to do something completely different. That feels like I do like that is. I mean, my heart goes out to like people who have early success with a novel, especially if it's very distinctive. And then it's like, well, do I need to totally reinvent it, or do I need to totally repeat myself? But with individual poems, it feels like that's part of what's great about that is like you don't. It's not like the whole book needs to be a cohesive hit. It's more like a handful of poems from it really stand out, and some others are like fun to read, and then some others are duds, and that's fine. So like that's just like the poet has a great deal of that's part of why I find it like really frustrating when people totally lock themselves into a mode when they're writing lyric poems. Because I feel like, well, you have different ones in there. You can, like Alan Shabira, who's like a friend and is a poet I've enjoyed for a while. Part of what I kind of like about his books, it's frustrating, but I also like it, is that he'll just have he'll just have multiple sections where he just does something completely different. And like often I really, really like one section and I don't love the others, but he's just working on different stuff and like trying,
Mm.
maybe the next book, this version of the thing will be better. And but yeah, there is something really sad, I think, about somebody who's reached like late middle age, early old age, really only writing a single kind of poem and nothing else his whole life, which is like a lot of tenured American poetry professors. Like that's a whole lot of them.
Well, you're making me also think of Clive James, who said in an interview really late in his life, like, I'm still just trying to write the perfect poem. And now I'm thinking of that comment and I'm like, yeah, but are you having fun? Or are
Yeah.
you really stressed?
Right.
I
He,
just hope Clive
yeah.
James is okay, you know? Like
Is he
that's my
still
main
alive?
concern. No.
Okay. He's definitively not okay. Let's tell you. Unfortunately, he is. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you there. There's got to be, again, it's like Ashbury's way of doing it is not the worst way, because like he was having fun. You don't have to worry about him. And
Thank God.
yeah, I mean, David Sherman Wallace does worry about him some here, but in some ways, I found his, what in a way, like as you said, like he seemed maybe to have written the social media part of the essay as the dessert portion, of which he, in order to complement the vegetables he was really interested in. I in some ways found his characterization of contemporary life as a poet to be refreshing, in that it, like, unlike Patterson, for example, just felt very true to life, even when it was really awful and depressing. Like he says, without support systems, poets discover themselves to be lackluster hustlers, half-hearted entrepreneurs paying $20 over and over again to enter the book contests that have become poetry's major conduit for publication. For many aspiring authors, self-presentation as an aesthetic project feels necessary, particularly in the case of marginalized people who must be their own boosters. But it also means that success seems increasingly synonymous with the cultivation of a personal brand. But I mean, it just felt like that kind of like shitty, striving, embarrassed, half-hearted online life felt so much more familiar to contemporary poetry than the peaceful, placid bus driver.
Yeah, but he also acknowledges that like we can't give up on this dream of being part of the canon, right?
Yeah.
Like the romantic image of the poet is powerful, and the dream of posthumous life is one of poetry's oldest attractions. Like I still believe in that, you know.
Yeah.
I still want to my great uncle was a writer of sea sonnets, and one of his sonnets got into the like school curriculum here in Australia. And to me, I'm like, well, that's something, you know. Maybe I could go for something like that. I don't know. It's just so depressing. Like the that characterization. I think he says here somewhere like. Most poets, it's not unusual for an emerging poet to have a better website than a Silicon Valley startup. Just like Jesus Christ, like it's so true. And you know, the whole thing about Amanda Gorman getting a modeling contract. And I still remember walking into the bookshop here in Melbourne and seeing The Hill We Climb, the book, and thinking, oh wow, she's put out a collection. And then I realized that the book is just the poem,
Yep.
and I nearly screamed.
That I don't know. It didn't even. My only thought was like, is that already in bookstores, or will they put it in bookstores after this speech is finished? Like
It was
it was
so
so,
quick.
yeah. Oh, I mean, yeah. That's. I mean, it was inevitable. And yeah, his remarks on her are, I think, pretty pretty apt. Again, like I know no beef with Amanda Gorman, but as he says, it is a different kind of influence than we might have thought. I mean, the same way that like there's the definition of fame has changed to become more, a little less robust and a little more value neutral than it maybe once was. And the thing that he said that I thought was really on point about this, after he brings up Amanda Gorman, he says, increasingly consumers are offered the image of art making as a subgenre of celebrity, and the works of art themselves are allowed to remain laudable but forgettable byproducts. For the serious reader or writer, perhaps celebrity is beside the point, but most find the social orbit difficult to escape. The result is thousands of voices clamoring against the algorithm, riffing on the same jokes. Poetry, good, bad, or distinct, good, bad, distinct, or homogenous, that should be homogeneous, I think, is somewhere else. And that seems quite right. That the poetry itself is secondary. I was talking to Jonathan Farmer last night, and he made the comparison to like going to a college football game where like you might follow the sport and the American football, I guess in this case. Though I guess you could have a college soccer game probably has a slightly different flavor to it, but like college football games are big spectacles that many people, at least here, like far prefer to professional football, even though like the game is not played at the same level, but it's sort of the atmosphere is richer and the sense of camaraderie is greater. And the comparison he was making was like it a lot of poetry, especially like high profile publications of poetry, feels like the college football game in that it needs to be a certain thing happening on the field. Like it couldn't just be anything. It couldn't just be bunny rabbits on the field. It has to be people in pads and balls crashing into each other. But it sort of doesn't really matter that much what it's, as long as it holds the place effectively. That's not the real attraction. It's the whole atmosphere, and that feels like a lot of how we treat poetry today.
Yeah, something just has to fill the poem-shaped void.
Right. Yeah. But it has to be
Yeah,
in with a certain texture. Not like
yeah,
there are poems you could put in there that would like make the record scratch. But
yeah. No, I just loved this paragraph, and I loved that point about the image of art making being the thing, which is kind of what I was trying to say when we were talking about Patterson. Like, and a lot of people got in touch with me afterwards, being like, "Wow, you got so wound up about this movie about a poet." That, like, nobody thinks that that's what poetry is, Alice. Like, calm down. But I do think it's important to push against it, because I think, yeah, the reality of what it is to try to write a decent poem in 2021 means that you've got to push against like this kind of manicured like gorgeousness that's constantly calling out to you and being like, but you could put up something like very simple and pretty, and then you could get a bunch of love hearts, and maybe that's all you need to do. Like that's a siren call, going on all the time.
oh God, there's something so depressing about the phrase love
Yeah,
hearts.
we've gone to a dark place.
love, love,
Ashbury.
love. Yeah.
Fuck, I need a drink.
Isn't it like 9 in the morning there?
It's 10:06.
All right. I was gonna say I've heard about you Australians. No. Oh,
Okay,
yeah.
so officially, Slee Ricketts episode, what this turns out to be, Alice Allan stops writing, Matthew Buckley Smith walks into the forest and never
Yeah,
to
yeah.
return.
Well, I was gonna say it was interesting. Like nobody came up to me after that episode and said like you got really wound up about that. No one was surprised. No one was concerned. Like it was sounded about in character for you.
Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah. So now we know who's a bad influence on who at this point. I think
Uh,
I am curious because it took me. All right, so yeah, I guess I had a couple. Like preparing for this. I ended up having like more tangential questions than I had direct questions. I'll say like it's a good essay. It's slightly unfocused. It feels a little bit like, as you said, like two essays, but it is a good essay worth reading. Dead Poet Anxiety and the Drift, and Shane McRae's very too short, but good essay. My War with John Ashbery. There'll obviously be links to both of those. I So I had a couple of thoughts. One was about, do you know Harold Bloom's The Anxiety of Influence?
I know of it.
Yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
have not read it.
I read it for the first time a few years ago, and I'm not equipped. I'm not a scholar, and I'm certainly not equipped to read and understand it. My impression was a little bit. It's like a 10-page, brilliant, insightful piece of literary criticism, intercut with a 140-page far out psychedelic like drug trip sequence from a 70s movie. It was put out in 1973, and it very much feels like it was put out in 1973. Like
Mm-hmm.
he ends up coming up with this whole bizarro mythology surrounding like what's basically like a pretty interesting argument about how poetic influence works, which is like it's a twofold argument. One is that every major poet is really wrestling with a predecessor. It's like really sort of in some kind of war with a preceding major poet. And then the other part of it, which I was thinking about today, is that here, I'll see if I have the quote. He says, poetic influence, when it involves two strong, authentic poets, always proceeds by a misreading of the prior act, an act of creative correction that is actually and necessarily a misinterpretation. The history of fruitful poetic influence, which is to say the main tradition of Western poetry since the Renaissance, is a history of anxiety and self-saving caricature, of distortion, of perverse, willful revisionism, without which modern poetry as such could not exist. I totally don't feel like I can. He's speaking with the the godlike authority he always had as a critic, as a formidable poetry scholar. I've never felt all that confident in saying this or that was a misinterpretation versus just an interpretation of a poem. But it does seem like, even in just editing interviews for this, I don't know how you've felt in going through your own interviews after the fact. It's like one thing to experience it at the moment. You experience it very differently when you're listening back through it and cutting spaces or ums or whatever. It is startling to me, even in conversation with, like, when there's a good rapport or even like an old history. It's amazing to me how often we end up speaking at cross purposes.
Totally. Yeah.
Not just about a particular poem that we maybe, by we, I mean like any two people talk, like, not even like you have a specific, slightly different opinion about something, but just like the particular sense of any given question or statement ends up being read at a slight refracted angle by the other person. And I don't know if that's like a necessary part of, it's cars and wheels couldn't work without friction. It feels almost like there's a necessary component to that, but it does seem like that's the great insight, I think, of his book. And it's part of what makes me not like, I can't ever totally dismiss Ashbery, just because it does seem like there's something that a lot of people have searched for and thought they found there, even if I don't know if any, well, some of their work ended up being worthwhile. And some of your models work came from like attempts to take something from there.
I mean, wouldn't it be luxurious to be able to dismiss somebody with that body of work, that legacy? Wouldn't it be such a relief to just go, actually, no, this is all bullshit. But no, there's beauty, and there's real depth of feeling. There's also like misfires and weirdness. Yeah, I guess if you write that much, well, it's not even that. It's not like he just sometimes happened to get it right. Like, he was clearly, yeah, he had access to this well, and he just kept going back to it. So yeah, we can't get away from him, even though talking about him is kind of sad and depressing. But
well, and that's why I keep going back to pleasure as a guy, because I think, like, as with like sex or food or something else, like, you don't have to say this thing has no value in order to say I'm not into it. like, it may be that it has value, but thankfully I don't have to like eat it or go to bed with it or like wear it or what, like, it's not for me. It's like, I'm going to let others enjoy that particular dish.
yeah, that seems like a sensible approach.
So I'm also curious, because it was one of the things that you said in our conversation that didn't register at the moment, but then I sort of heard later in going back through the recording. You said you've been doing this for 10 years, this being poetry. And I think, based on something else you said in another episode, that I always assume everybody is either much younger or much older than I am, but I think we may be about the same age, because
I thought you were older than me.
Well, I may be a little, but I mean, you said you were in high school in 97, 98.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, me too. So we're at least we're in spitting distance of each other.
Yeah, I'm 38. I was born in 1982.
Okay. Yeah, I'm 39. I was born in 82 as well. So right.
So you're heaps older than me. So
yeah,
I've got
exactly.
so much time. I'm fine. I'm fine.
Yeah. What was I reading the last time? Oh, it was Alyssa Gabbard. That one feels like one is on a walking sidewalk into the void. Maybe she was right after all. So what did you mean by, like, when you say you started 10 years ago, or you've been doing this for 10 years? How did you mean that? Because I don't, like, that both feels long and short.
I just meant that when I decided to try to actually write a poem rather than sit around feeling smug because everyone was saying that one day I'd be a writer, the day that I started, like, I actually tried to do that was in about 2007. So getting on, like, well past 10 years now, actually more towards 15.
But you've been writing for a long time. And what was it that because I mean, I'm just curious, like that you didn't do an English degree in college, and you've not done like a degree program in poetry, which you're not missing much. uh, but like it was specific. I'm curious, like why did you had a sense that people said like you were going to be a writer, but then why would you? It almost feels like if people said like you're going to be a great athlete, and you're like, so one day I picked up a hula hoop. It's like why did you then why was it poetry that you said like there was something that you like your friend were like I want to join this cult? What was the why that choice?
I can't answer that question. I don't know why it had to be poetry. I just know that it did. I know what spurred me to sit down and actually do that work was, the thing that drives me most of the time, which is just searing creative jealousy. Um, I had a friend I was doing Islamic studies, and she sat down next to me and introduced herself, and then talked about how much she was writing. She's like, oh, I write 1,000 words a day. I wrote 5,000 words yesterday, and I was like, oh fuck you, bitch! I'm gonna write something too. And it was
5,000
just,
words.
yeah, no, I mean, look, the quality aside,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
the fact that someone was actually doing it, it made me feel like, oh, whoa, okay, the test has already started, and I haven't even found the exam room yet. Like, I need to start now, and and so I did, and I was lucky that like the first couple of poems I sent out had like tiny little skerricks of minor success, and that was enough for me to keep pushing through once I started aiming a bit higher and getting summarily rejected for many years.
What was the word you used? Scarix?
Yeah, just like little, tiny little staple journals being like, yeah, that'll do.
Maybe I don't know if I'm hearing your accent or if I'm hearing a word I've never heard before. Scarix.
Skerricks.
Spell it.
Look it up.
All right. How do I look it up? How do you spell it? It could be spelled about 15 different ways.
I don't know how you spell it.
All right. All right. You don't know how to. It's not a real word. Yeah, you basically just sort of started on your own, just going from scratch.
Yeah, and I guess a little bit like I feel like Shane's essay is sort of prompting me to try to be a lot more honest, and like listening to your podcast as well is sort of pushing me in this direction. But like I feel like it's important to say too that for many years I just wrote and didn't read. I just
Oh
wrote
yeah, yeah,
stuff
yeah.
and was like, oh, this sounds like a poem, I'm gonna send it and see what happens. And then once I started getting pushback and things started coming back to me with their tails between their legs, I was like, oh, maybe I better actually look into what this really is and figure out if I can actually do it. And yeah, I started, I mean, so yeah, I guess I was about 25 when I started writing. And I didn't really start getting serious and actually reading until I was sort of in my early 30s. So I've always felt like I was just so late to everything.
I think yeah. I mean, I think that if you don't feel that, then either you're like Alexander Pope, who taught himself like Latin, Greek, and French by the time he was 15, or like you're not being honest. Like like you have to be. You are always late to the game. If you what's the Leopardi line? Like everything is improved since Homer except poetry. I mean, I'm honestly, I mean, I'm just impressed that you were able to kind of come to some of those recognitions on your own without having to be like walloped about the head. Because I think what you said about like writing a lot without reading a lot is really common. And I certainly was incredibly lazy about writing or about reading for long, especially like when I in the one thing I forgot to praise in the Michael Robbins book was that it unabashedly celebrates smoking cigarettes, which is refreshing, which I've not seen in a while, in which like Cameron or any young person who happens to listen, like cigarettes are bad, don't smoke them, but it's the best drug in the world, and it's the best. I mean, for writing, there's like nothing is better, and like definitely for the years when I was like really smoking heavily, you can just write all night. You could write endlessly, and also at the same, if you're me, often forget to bother to fucking read anything along the way. So I think like you're like you're right to feel hangdog about that, but I also think like that's really, really common for young poets.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's useful to bring it back around to this essay, but I feel like that's the thing that Wallace isn't really properly saying or isn't properly willing to say is that yeah, a lot of these poets who are doing the image of art making just aren't reading. Like I was sort of like vacillating about whether to bring this up, but I have another friend who doesn't like poetry and finds my interest in poetry like very like, oh, good for you. Like she's very like, oh, that's sweet. And then one day she handed me this book by an Instagram poet by the name of Kate Bayer. And she's like, Alice, I found poetry. I found my way into poetry. And I'm like, oh, this is great. She's like, I get it. I understand why you do what you do. And then I read this book and I was like, oh my God, this isn't what I'm trying to do. Please don't misunderstand.
What do you think of when it comes to like truly the bad, like insta poetry stuff? Well, like I read it, there are a few of these. Ruby Kaur among them. Who it seems to be truly trite, insubstantial silliness. How do you feel about that as a like? I try not to begrudge anybody their pleasures in reading poetry. Do you think that has any relationship to other poetry or like poetry you might care about as a gateway drug or as an anything, or is it just basically a separate game?
Yeah, like I don't know if it's like really lame to take the position of, well, at least my friend is starting to become comfortable with the form and maybe eventually she'll read something else and then she'll look back on this stuff. I mean, I can hardly sit here and be like, oh, I wrote for 5 years without reading anything and sent out a bunch of poems and hoping they were going to get published, and then turn around and say like, oh, someone like Kate Bayer is not legitimate, is not poetry. Like that's a totally bullshit position. But look, it's just hard not to be resentful because so much adoration, so like such a big profile, so much like love coming towards that poetry. It's not that I want it instead, but it's just like there's better stuff out there. But then
Yeah.
then you just sound like a wanker.
I mean, if you
You
are going
get
to be somebody
completely
who
trapped.
runs a poetry podcast and you don't want to sound like a wanker, it's probably a lost battle. But
Don't know what you mean.
your friends are so much more sane and patient and gentle and trusting and credulous. Yeah. I mean, I do. Yeah, I do kind of wonder, like as with any sort of like there are songs my daughters love that are not good songs, but I trust that maybe they're like at a certain point, if it doesn't get cloying in your mouth, then maybe you're not gonna ever like poetry. Like at a certain point, if you keep coming back to the same thing and it keeps being satisfying to you, then like, all right, fine. But presumably there are some people at least who read that stuff and kind of get a little charge out of it. And in the same way that like you might hear some kind of like oblique, soulful pop music lyrics and think like, oh, that's really deep. But then like, then you get older and you like other things are a little bit more satisfying. Presumably for some people, it's got to be a way in, but probably for plenty, it never really gets like plenty of people's like taste in TV never improves over their lifespan. So why should it be so different with poetry?
Yeah, and when what you're saying is, oh no, come into this Wallace calls it the small back room. Like, come in here, like we're reading Ashbury. It's like that doesn't sound like fun. I
No,
don't want
yeah.
to do that. Yeah, it's hard to make the case sometimes, and particularly when you've got Ern Malley in your like the biggest presence in the poetry canon is a fake and a hoax, and that just kind of colors everything. At least it does for me. Yeah.
What do you? Well, so personally speaking, do you? Because I don't know that I know of Ern Malley. I can't think of a single poem of his I've read. What do you think of the poems themselves?
Could I read one
Yeah,
for you?
please,
A
please,
little
please.
bit
Yeah,
of one?
yeah.
I mean, it's not like I was not angling to do that.
Oh yeah, I
Um,
was gonna say you've held up that book a number of times. I'm
okay,
very.
yeah, I got the book here.
My wife would say I'm
Uh,
very bad at reading body language.
so I picked this one because the title is Colloquy with John Keats, and it's got this epigraph from Odes of Solomon. And the Lord destroyeth the imagination of all them that had not the truth with them. This is just the first stanza. I have been bitter with you, my brother, remembering that saying of Lenin when the shadow was already on his face. The emotions are not skilled workers. Yet we are as the double almond concealed in one shell. I have mistrusted your apodytic strength, saying always, yet why did you not finish Hyperion? But now I have learned not to curtail what was in you, the valency of speech, the bond of molecular utterance. So it's just total gibberish, but it's not like immediately recognizable as such.
Is it so? I'm curious how people read that. Is it read as funny?
Yeah, I've been to readings where we have like recited, Mali poems to each other, and it's hilarious. Everyone just falls about.
But I mean, is it like I need to track down. There's a guy I knew in college who went on to have a fair amount of success in poetry, but he was like a very funny, very smart guy, but he wrote like he got into the most prestigious writing program in the country with a poem called Shit Laser. And like he
Nice.
had another poem called Tits and Ass. And like it was all basically like all of his poems were I mean, very smartly, but like deliberately very stupid and bad, but in a way that was really funny to read. And so that reads to me like a parody. And as a parody, it could be pretty. I mean, again, like I guess it was a parody, and it is pretty funny. But it is it not received that way? Like was Ern Malley himself read as a parodist?
Not at first. No, he was read as a genius.
Okay. Huh.
Like
So,
only once they came out and said no, we made it all up, and then
right.
people
Then
started to
then
forget.
people read it in like Bill Murray quotation marks as
I think so. Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Yeah, that would make it hard to that would be a fly in the ointment as if
It's
I
a
were
bit
an Australian.
paralyzing. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and people still read that as like serious good poetry today, or they
Um.
read it as. I mean, is it read as like as Andy Kaufman kind of like it's
Yeah, that's a good comparison. Actually, I think people still go back and forth. David Brooks, who I mentioned last time we chatted, has this huge long book about the Malley hoax and tries, in a very complicated way, to make the case that they knew exactly what they were doing and they were actually making something very artistically worthwhile and beautiful. And they didn't do it in an afternoon; they did it over years. And they were harking back to this other hoax that was happening in France. So like, we we can't let go of it.
yeah.
Yeah.
That does feel yeah. I mean, that, in a way, like it feels almost like it's Australia's one that got away. Like there's like
Yeah.
like you're sort of hoodwinked in a way, but also taken in, and like you can't quite like well, I know she wasn't good for us, but boy, we like I can't
She was
stop.
very, very
Yeah,
beautiful.
that's
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
write all my love songs about her still. Yeah, yeah. Okay, I mean, I can see that leaving a sort of a mark. And when was that exactly?
1944.
Okay, all right.
So yeah, I guess there's a slim chance that Ashbury was aware of the. Well, no, he would have been a bit young, I guess, but he might have heard about it at some point.
It's so perfectly Ashbarian. Yeah, I mean, that's no. And as you said, he taught him for years and years. So,
Hmm.
do you have a copy of either of the two Ashbury poems that you mentioned really liking, Some Trees or the one about the office?
Yeah.
Would
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
would you read one of those for us so we can actually hear something that is like good Ashbury and
Good
so,
Ashbury.
yeah.
I feel like it's so basic to read Some Trees, but
I don't,
Sorry.
it doesn't, I'm sure I've read it at some point. It doesn't come to mind. So I don't, yeah.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
I feel like everyone's it's gonna be the biggest eye roll ever.
They started rolling their eyes before the music kicked in.
Okay. All right. Okay. Some trees. These are amazing, each joining a neighbour, as though speech were a still performance, arranging by chance to meet as far this morning from the world as agreeing with it. You and I are suddenly what the trees try to tell us we are. That their merely being there means something. That soon we may touch, love, explain. And, glad not to have invented such comeliness, we are surrounded. A silence already filled with noises. A canvas on which emerges a chorus of smiles. A winter morning, placed in a puzzling light and moving. Our days put on such reticence. These accents seem their own defense.
Yeah, that is different than a lot of the Ashbury I think of when I think of Ashbury, partly because it feels earnest.
Yeah. Apparently, people read it at weddings all the time.
Yeah. So there's some of the same opacity and lack of context in that one, but they're even just the suggestion of two people being together, being in love, a longing and an attempt to, like, there's a feeling there at least that the some of the opacity or the what's Steph Burt's line, the elliptical quality of it feels like it is a faltering attempt to communicate something
Yeah.
rather than just a misdirection.
I just find it really moving for that reason because it's just talking about that. Um, it's soon we may touch, love, explain. It's not happening yet. It's not happening now. Yeah, there's a distance between the two people in the poem. Um, Although I think I read somewhere that Ashbury's generally talking about a plural you, like not necessarily one person. But I don't know, it's very quiet and romantic and yeah, it turns out I'm really bad at expressing why I like things in poetry.
It's
Yep.
hard to do.
It's hard. It's
Yeah,
hard.
it's really hard, and I don't know if this is true in Australia, but nobody wants to fucking review poems. It's like one reason I can't ride Elizabeth Gabbert too hard, because like people don't want to do that work. Like it's
Yeah.
really thankless for the most part, and it's hard to do, and most people will talk about something else rather than talk about poetry. Like, I mean, it's hard to like find anybody to pay to write poetry reviews.
Yeah, I hate doing it. I absolutely hate doing it.
Have you done much?
Yeah, well, because Bonnie used to be the reviews editor at Cordite, so she would ask me to review books, and it was really good for me to do it, but it's just so hard because you almost invariably are at least peripherally aware of the person that you're reviewing. At least when I started out, I felt like I was missing huge chunks of context, so I couldn't really like say with any authority why what someone was even doing. So yeah, it forced me to learn a bunch of stuff. I don't think the reviews that I wrote were particularly used to anyone, and it's always just that sort of pattern of like this poet, few bad things, but they're great. The end.
I mean, even that you're able to include few bad things stands apart from most American criticism, which is
Oh, it was so gentle, so
just long.
gentle.
It's long form blurbing. I mean, it's not even like I'm even if it's just like neutral description, I feel like that's a triumph. Uh, because it, I mean, no, because so seldom is it even that. It's just uh polysyllabic thumbs up. That's like there. I mean, there are like blurbs are also the worst, truly. But like it was interesting reading. I just so tonight walked up before talking to you. I walked up to get the mail, and tonight your book finally arrived. So I
No
literally
way.
like read the first poem and I read the blurb on the back from Bonnie Cassidy, and that one actually is sort of oddly descriptive of like a person sort of, I mean, in a way, like she's sort of describing like you're trying to the process of your sort of figuring out how to write poems. So it feels a little bit more like an actual paragraph with sentences in it, rather than just a paragraph shaped smear on the back of the page, back cover.
But it's funny because those paragraph shaped smears set up this expectation, right? Like, so when Bonnie sent that to me, and I respect her so much and I owe her so much, and she's also like, she's a genius and a lovely person. But I wanted a gold star, and she basically she wrote this blurb that was just like quite descriptive of like, here's what Alice is doing, and I'm like, oh, quietly heartbroken.
I think, yeah, that's my favorite blurb. It was on the back of Ben Marcus's first novel, Notable American Women. The blurb, it was, I think they may have gotten rid of it but on the arc I got, it was the blurb was, "Don't believe a single word that comes out of Ben's rotten, filthy heart." It was his father. Yeah, and I mean, like, a somewhat honest blurb is incredibly refreshing. This is also why I think, I mean, again, like, don't read your fucking blurbs. Don't read anything anyone says about your poems unless it's. I feel like my rule of thumb is like, unless it's someone who's in the ship with you,
Mm.
like someone who's in some way on the hook with you, either like as a long time like friend, person you're like reading with and corresponding with, or like a spouse, or like somebody, so some of his family can be the worst readers, but like, yeah, somebody from a distance just giving you a thumbs up for whatever they think you're doing. So that's the worst. It's the worst thing in the world. And I think what is true for blurbs here is, I think, exactly what's true for journals here, which is, as you said with Eleanor, like, nobody fucking reads them. The one thing they read is the table of contents. And when you read, like, the purpose of blurbs is the list of names. And that's really it. Like,
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
no, sorry, you just reminded me of something like I urgently have to tell you. So,
Oh, yeah, please.
here's my best poems of Jane Kenyon.
Oh.
Yeah, so this came out from Grey Wolf last year, I think.
Oh, nice.
Selected by Donald Hall. I think it is a batshit boring selection.
Oh, really?
I think he chose all the most boring poems. But there is a blurb on here from none other than our friend of the podcast, Kaveh Akbar.
Uh-huh.
And I'm kind of like, why? Why? This just annoyed me because Kaveh says it's easy to forget she was a visionary too, a mystic. No. No. No, no, no. Jane Kenyon would be so pissed off with that.
I mean, it's just so condescending to start with, but then, like, it's easy to forget she was a visionary. I mean, why begin with?
She doesn't have to be a mystic. No.
She's quite down to earth, as I recall. I mean,
yeah.
It does seem like Hall was the worst person to. I mean, you see why they picked him, because he's famous, but like, why would you? It seems like unfair to do to him, also. Like,
I mean, nobody else could have. But like, these are not the best poems of Jane Kenyon. Just know that.
That was my conversation with Alice Allan. You can find her, as always, at the Poetry Says podcast and at poetry_says on Twitter, as well as somewhere on Instagram, but I couldn't for the life of me figure out where. Maybe she has a private account. It doesn't want you to find her there anyway. As I said before, I'm hoping Alice will come back and we'll have a few more of these sort of bullshit sessions. I am going to be on her podcast, Poetry Says, in a month or so to talk about whatever the fuck she wants to talk about. I mentioned before that there are going to be some interesting guests coming up. Please do feel free, as always, to write me at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com to suggest guests or topics you'd like to hear about, or as well as any thoughts you have about anything we have said here today. Thank you, as always, for listening, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.